In the lush fields of antebellum Virginia, whispers carried further than gunfire. Farms sat wide and proud across rolling hills, but beneath polished parlors and polished manners there were secrets, some innocent, most far from it. The year is 1858, a time when the world of the Old South seemed secure on the surface, yet it was filled with the kinds of betrayals and strange intimacies that history books often tried to bury. Among the most unsettling whispers were those surrounding a pair of identical twins, two young women whose bond broke every rule of polite society. They shared not only their laughter and childhood games, but also their husbands, their closest confidences, and eventually their darkest crimes. Neighbors would later claim that anyone who looked into their eyes felt uneasy, unable to tell one twin apart from the other. What no one could deny was that together they embodied something both magnetic and menacing, a closeness so powerful that it twisted into obsession. What began as quiet scandal within dining rooms and rumor mills in Virginia would unravel into a tale of betrayal, conspiracy, and death that left an entire countryside shaken. Before we unfold this chilling story, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This channel is where hidden history meets dark truth, and every week we uncover stories more unsettling than the last. Subscribe now so you do not miss the secrets still waiting in the shadows. And while you are here, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. These tales are part of our shared past, and I love seeing this community stretch across states and beyond. Today, we unlock the secrets of Virginia's most disturbing twins, where family loyalty turned into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Virginia in the year 1858 was not a place of quiet simplicity, though many who lived there wished it to be. The plantation houses stood in their rigid order, cotton and tobacco shaping not only the soil, but the lives of every soul bound to it. Aristocratic families clung tightly to their traditions and their reputations. It was an era where gossip circulated as currency and family honor had to be defended fiercely, sometimes at unspeakable costs. Within this tense and often suffocating environment lived two sisters whose bond would soon defy everything society claimed to hold sacred. They were not just any sisters, but identical twins, and from the very start of their lives they were treated as curiosities. Neighbors recalled whispers about how inseparable they had been as children, side by side from their first steps to the early games of girlhood. In the schoolhouse they sat together on the same bench, struggled through their letters together, and sometimes even switched places when their lessons became tedious. What seemed innocent to the community at first began to feel more unsettling as the girls reached adolescence. They mirrored one another in voice, expression, even in their private gestures, as if each one's identity bled into the other. Those who attempted to court them separately were driven away, not by any harsh words, but by the invisible barrier that bound the twins so tightly together. They behaved as though they were the halves of one whole, and the notion of independence was alien to them both. The family owned a modest estate, not one of the grand plantations often recounted in tales of the antebellum South, but respectable enough to keep them within Virginia's upper social class. Their father died unexpectedly, leaving their mother to manage the household and protect her daughter's futures in a world where reputation was often more valuable than coin. Pressure to secure marriages for the two girls grew with each passing year, and eventually arrangements were made that seemed suitable to preserve dignity and security. What no one could have expected was that their marriages would become the very stage upon which secrets and betrayals would be etched into Virginia's soil. The elder of the men, Thomas Ellery, was a stern-faced figure, proud to his core, the kind of man who believed his name alone carried authority. He was ambitious, often traveling to Richmond to cultivate political contacts, a man obsessed with climbing higher. The second husband, Daniel Price, was by contrast softer in demeanor, prone to looking over his shoulder as though expecting unseen dangers. He was quieter, less certain of himself, more willing to be guided by the stronger voices around him. From the very beginning, the arrangement of these marriages seemed strained, though no outward quarrels were apparent. The oddity lay in how the sisters themselves behaved within the union. Most women who married siblings sought to create clear boundaries between their households and their affections. But the twins were different. Servants in their homes would recount stories that blurred the lines between the two marriages. They shared meals as though they were one family rather than two. At night, no one ever knew for certain which husband slept under which roof. Frequently, the twins would switch without notice, claiming illness or inventing small excuses that allowed them to spend evenings together. By the dim glow of lantern light, their laughter filled one room while silence swallowed the other, and eventually rumors began to crawl through the nearby farms that more than innocent sisterly bonds were maintaining their closeness. Gossip in small communities often acts as a warning bell, though it is ignored as easily as it is heard. For the men involved, there was an uneasy recognition that their wives were not fully theirs in the way tradition dictated. Both Thomas and Daniel became trapped in webs they could neither articulate publicly nor fully escape. Divorce was a shameful option, scandal unthinkable. Instead, the men drifted into silent agreements that blurred propriety. Jealousies stirred but were muffled. Suspicions emerged but were quickly buried. It was this silence, this suffocating acceptance of what could not be openly confronted, that would grant the sisters the cover they needed as their lives shifted from peculiar to sinister. The first crime began quietly. So quietly, in fact, that at first no one even realized it was a crime. It was December of that year when a neighbor named Elise Montgomery fell ill after visiting the sisters for supper. At the time, no suspicion lingered. Illness, particularly in winter, was common and often deadly. Yet Elise spoke on her sickbed of the strange bitterness in the wine she had been offered. Her husband laughed off the complaint, insisting it was likely the tang of the cask. She died within the week, her sudden passing adding another name to the endless procession of lives shortened in that era. But servants whispered more than her widower allowed himself to hear. The wine, they claimed, had been poured by one twin, while the other whispered behind her shoulder. Which twin it had been was never clear, for they moved like reflections across glass. Even when confronted with questions from their own mother, the sisters would smile calmly, their tone gentle, and insist it was all in the imagination of servants with too much time. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and in communities where everyone knew one another's business, such seeds never failed to root. By spring of 1859, tension wrapped around the estate like ivy clinging tight to stone. Thomas grew short-tempered and often left the household for longer trips under the pretense of politics. Daniel grew more withdrawn, retreating into brandy and long evenings by the fire, staring at his glass as if the truth might be revealed at the bottom. The twins, however, flourished under the strain. In public gatherings, they dazzled with their charms, sewing circles remarking on how the sisters seemed untouched by grief or worry, while others withered under losses more ordinary than theirs. To outside eyes, it seemed as if fate itself bent in their favor. The true nature of their deceptions, however, only revealed itself once a series of disappearances struck the nearby county roads. Traveling salesmen, men who carried goods and coin, vanished along stretches of highway not far from the sisters' estate. At first, these incidents were attributed to bandits. The roads of Virginia had long been plagued by thieves. But when clues began to emerge, authorities and neighbors alike reconsidered. Among Elise Montgomery's belongings, locked away by her grieving husband, a small scrap of paper was discovered. It contained words scrawled hastily in her hand. "Do not drink what they offer. Tell Daniel." What revelation she intended would never be known with certainty. Yet her final message ignited whispers now fueled by fear rather than idle curiosity. Whispers spread about how Daniel Price had grown gaunt, his hollow-eyed presence at the market stirring quiet pity, while Thomas Ellery seemed tormented by shame too heavy to voice. It was said that both women spent long hours walking arm in arm around the garden, heads bent close together, their voices low, their faces unreadable. And there were stories, too, of arguments behind closed doors, muffled but unmistakable, voices of men breaking under the weight of something impossible to endure. The final crack in their carefully crafted image came one night when fire lit the horizon. A barn on the Ellery property blazed straight into the sky, its contents consumed in a roar heard across the valley. Inside, neighbors later discovered, had been storehouses of goods never accounted for, bolts of cloth, casks of whiskey, saddlebags bearing initials of men thought missing, all hidden, all apparently hoarded by hands that had never confessed their presence. By dawn, accusations spread faster than the ashes, and the web began to unravel. If you are still here with me, listen closely. This tale is only beginning to show its darkest corners. As twisted as it already seems, with bonds that blurred love and crime, the story of Virginia's most haunting twins dives further into betrayals, that splintered families and scarred reputations for decades. And it will leave you wondering just how far loyalty can push two people beyond the limits of morality and into the abyss. The night of the barn fire in 1859 marked a turning point in the quiet county. Until then, the bizarre intimacy of the sisters had been fuel for gossip, but not for genuine fear. With the fire smoke still hanging low across the hillsides, everything changed. The discovery inside the ruins, labels torn from crates, saddlebags marked with initials of the missing, and half-burnt ledgers nobody dared read aloud, shifted suspicion from whispers to accusation. Men who had long swallowed their doubts about the twins began to voice them openly. Women who had once tolerated them in their sewing circles suddenly crossed streets to avoid their company. The twins had not only strayed from convention, they had stepped into a darkness that threatened to consume the entire community. Thomas Ellery, proud as ever, fought to contain the damage, insisting publicly that the goods in the barn had been purchased legitimately and accusing jealous neighbors of spreading slander. But his voice trembled each time he defended the sisters, a trembling that betrayed more than his words intended. Daniel, meanwhile, vanished for days at a time. Some said they saw him wandering the woods, muttering prayers under his breath. Others spoke of him seen late at taverns, drinking himself silent until he slumped over tables. His gaunt appearance told a story no words could alter. He was a man haunted by something he could not name. The twins themselves changed little, at least outwardly. They appeared once more at Sunday service, immaculately dressed, their hands clasped together, as though they drew strength not from faith, but from their bond with one another. Their calmness frightened even the minister. His sermon that day, unusually impassioned, lingered for weeks in parishioners' minds. Warnings about wolves in sheep's clothing, about serpents disguised in beauty. The sisters smiled politely as if every word was meant for others, never for them. It took little time before neighbors noted another disturbing pattern. Those who dared voice loud suspicions frequently found themselves plagued by sudden misfortunes. A mule crippled overnight, a child struck by unexplained fever, a valuable heifer gone missing from a field without trace. Bad luck, some argued. Punishment from Providence, others suggested. But those who whispered more candidly began to wonder whether the sisters had hands in such fates, too subtle to be caught and too cruel to be denied. The county's air grew heavy with superstition. It was in this tense atmosphere that a group of young men, emboldened by ale and gossip, decided to confront the sisters one evening at the Ellery estate. Their intention, as later told, was no more than to demand answers about the missing salesman and the strange goods uncovered in the fire. But when they arrived, lanterns bobbing in the dark and sticks in hand, the sisters appeared at the doorway together, calm as ever. They did not cower nor protest. Instead, they stood silently, hands linked, with eyes that reflected the lantern light like glass. Something in that unearthly calm unnerved the young men. Their courage faltered, and one by one they turned away. To the astonishment of the county, those same young men began to speak afterward, not of courage but of dread, describing the encounter as if they had faced not women but spirits, something uncanny, unnatural, and impenetrable. That same year, a traveling preacher passed through, a man certain of devils, and eager to cast them out wherever he could. He declared from pulpit and field alike that unnatural bonds often signified wickedness, that God himself had not seen fit to grant one soul two bodies, and that such twins were cursed by design. The sisters listened to his sermon in silence once more, though a faint smile touched their lips. And when the preacher's horse collapsed and died mysteriously the following morning, tongues wagged across the valley louder than ever before. Whispers now gave way to open fracture. Families split on whether the twins were victims of hysteria or masterminds of some darker scheme. Some defended them still, insisting accusations against the sisters were nothing more than scapegoating during troubled times. Others prepared to take justice into their own hands. And yet through it all, no proof beyond rumor and suspicion could be laid directly at their feet. Every disappearance remained without witness. Every death could be explained away by accident or nature. Each piece of evidence seemed just too thin, and in that thinness lay their terrifying strength. It was Daniel Price whose silence cracked first. Records that survived in county ledgers, pieced together from testimonies decades later, suggest that Daniel confided to a traveling physician that he feared for his life. Whether the twins overheard his confession, or whether they simply anticipated his break, is unknown. What is known is that Daniel's body was later found in the shallows of a river, lungs filled with water, a blow to his temple suggesting he had been struck before he drowned. The coroner listed the cause as accident, but few believed it. Even fewer were bold enough to say otherwise aloud. Thomas Ellery stood as the final barrier between the sisters and complete exposure. His pride held him silent, but in his eyes, neighbors claimed they saw the truth. He aged rapidly, his once black hair streaked through with gray before his 40th year, his once booming voice thinning into something quieter, fragile. Yet he persisted, dining at the twins' table, walking with them to services, nodding his head against the murmurs. Some argued he was complicit, others insisted he was a prisoner in plain sight. Whatever the reality, his silence tied him to their fate irreversibly. It was the spring of 1860 when the next disappearance cemented fears into certainty. A merchant named Elias Cobb, who had been delivering bolts of imported cloth, vanished somewhere along the road that passed no more than a mile from the Ellery estate. His wagon was later discovered abandoned, ponies still harnessed, but the man gone. In the wreckage of his goods, scraps of cloth matched those later seen hanging as drapes within the sisters' parlor. Too bold to ignore, one neighbor made the observation in public. Too bold, too dangerous. Within weeks, his own fortunes collapsed, his house struck by fire while he was away, and his wife taken by sudden illness. The man swore vengeance, but his grief scattered him westward, away from Virginia's fields and gossip alike. Neighbors began to adopt a new habit. They crossed themselves without hesitation when the twins passed on the road. Doors shut quickly when lantern light signaled their approach. Mothers called children indoors if their laughter approached the property's edge. Fear preserved the sisters far better than respect ever had. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend. These are not simply tales of long-past scandals, but echoes of the dangers that creep in when secrecy binds people tighter than morality can permit. Despite the fear they provoked, despite the evidence mounting in murmurs and fragments, no official charge was ever brought against the twins. The county sheriff balked each time rumors demanded his attention, citing insufficient proof, preferring to remain distant from the unrest. It was not unusual in those years. Lawmen often measured their duty less by justice than by survival and reputation. To accuse women of standing as the root of highway disappearances, theft, and death, without undeniable witness, was to risk ridicule or worse. And so, the twins sailed on in their silence, eerily unscathed. Years seemed to slink by, yet tragedy continued to coil around them. More merchants vanished. Another farmhouse burned. One of Thomas's business associates never arrived at his destination. Their land, curious enough, seemed to prosper even while others in the county struggled. It is said by some accounts that the estate's stores of food were always suspiciously flush, that brandy casks never seemed to run dry, that hens laid more than the neighbors, and that their grounds were better maintained than a small household should have managed. How could two sisters and one weary husband manage abundance when so much around them rotted from misfortune? That question rippled through Sunday pews and tavern benches, but no one dared ask it to their faces. The outbreak of the Civil War soon after shifted attention away from their scandalous lives. Virginia erupted into unrest and death on a scale that dwarfed their local tragedies. Men marched off to battles as far away as Tennessee and as near as Bull Run. Some would never return, others came back broken and hollow. Amid such chaos, the strange story of the twins lost its grip on the community. Not forgotten, but buried under the weight of national disaster. Yet those who survived into old age still swore that even as cannon fire shook the land, few evils had ever unsettled their nights as fully as the haunting memory of those sisters who shared everything. Husbands, secrets, and crimes too neatly covered to ever be dragged into clean daylight. Some claim their fate was sealed during those war years, though documentation is thin and stories contradict. According to one vein of rumor, Thomas Ellery eventually perished not from war, but from poison slipped into his evenings of brandy. Others insisted he vanished completely, a weary horse returning riderless one evening to the stable. As for the twins themselves, the last official record places them fleeing westward, their names absent from registers after 1864. Whether they re-emerged in another county under assumed identities or vanished into the fold of war's confusion has never been confirmed. And yet, their legend lingers. Farmers plowing the fields near the ruined Ellery barn would tell their children that if they glanced too long into the shadows, they could still see two figures hand in hand, indistinguishable, watching with eyes brighter than the lantern's flame. Servants who had once toiled on the estate passed down stories of voices echoing in empty rooms, laughter where no one had stood. It became the sort of tale that older generations used to hush the young, warnings about loyalty carried too far, about trust perverted into sin, about bonds so strong they consumed everything in their path. The Civil War swept across Virginia like a tide of fire, drowning every farm, household, and memory in its relentless march. For 4 years, the land lay as much in ashes as in soil, and in that great convulsion of armies, the local scandals of one county seemed to shrink into insignificance. Young men who had once whispered nervously about the Ellery estate now carried rifles rather than rumors. Mothers who once huddled at sewing circles to trade suspicions now prayed for the lives of their sons. The war had a way of forcing silence on every smaller matter, though silence did not mean that memory had died. Even as soldiers moved in confusion across the countryside, some still muttered about the sisters. Their estate, curiously untouched by the worst wreckage, remained a place neighbors avoided. Others saw soldiers traveling near their land vanish without explanation. When regiments passed through, moving toward Richmond or retreating from skirmishes, supplies occasionally disappeared, and wagons failed to return. Some chalked it up to the chaos of war, others glanced uneasily toward the twins. No one could ever prove anything, and yet suspicion clung. War created shadows deep enough that nearly any crime could slip through unnoticed. Soldiers vanished into the bloodied soil of Virginia by the tens of thousands, their names lost to casualty lists. What did 2 or 10 more matter when thousands lay dead upon battlefields stretching for miles? The twins understood this well, and their story seemed to fold into that larger tragedy, giving them cover greater than they had ever known. It was precisely in that chaos that rumors claim they reinvented themselves. From bits of diary fragments and letters that survived, we know that wealthy landholders who once surrounded the twins lost everything: crops burned, houses looted, fortunes shattered. And yet the sisters living quietly on their estate seemed to weather storm after storm without ruin. A Confederate officer passing through in 1862 described in a letter the unusual hospitality of 2 identical ladies upon one Arcadian household, strange in manner yet graced with abundance where others suffer famine. That letter, later found in his trunk after his death at Fredericksburg, suggests that by some means the sisters ensured survival amidst general devastation. Scholars have debated how. Some say it was cunning barter, others theft, others darker means. Stories crept among the rank and file that 2 women near the roads out of Lynchburg offered travelers food and drink, and that some who accepted were never seen again. Soldiers desperate for respite may have fallen victim to circumstances far older than the war itself, yet no inquiry could be made. Armies had no patrols to spare for ghost stories. Captains ignored such talk as campfire whispers. In wartime, ghosts haunted everyone. The twins became part of that ghostly tapestry. Thomas Ellery himself fades from record soon after 1861. The most generous explanation is that he joined the Confederate cause and perished on some battlefield unmarked and unnamed. Less generous accounts say he died under his own roof, victim of poison or violence no one dared investigate. By 1862, visitors to the Ellery estate referenced only the sisters themselves. They received men at the door together. They oversaw the fields together. And at supper tables, the talk was often of the ladies, indistinguishable from one another, as though husband and father alike had been erased. Small remnants paint a picture of dread among neighboring farms. A farmer's wife recounted in a surviving letter that she would rather walk miles out of her way than pass their gates after dark. Another mentioned hearing laughter on still nights carrying from the estate when no lanterns shone, as though the twins feasted by shadows alone. Yet the official Confederate muster rolls, census registers, and county tax reports record nothing out of the ordinary. The sisters were invisible to the institutions that might have scrutinized them. It was during this period that their legend hardened into something almost supernatural. Men came back from war scarred, missing limbs or staring mute into nothingness, and when asked about their horrors, some whispered not about the carnage of Antietam or Cold Harbor, but about nights in Virginia when they stumbled upon the Ellery estate and felt they had stepped into another world. One Confederate deserter, caught and interrogated before his hanging, insisted he had fled not the Union Army but the twin specters of Lynchburg, claiming they offered him drink, and he awoke 3 days later to find his pockets empty and his companion vanished forever. Was it delirium, a dying man's excuse? Or was it another trace of what locals already suspected? Some merchant records suggest bolts of cloth and barrels of provisions were sold in other counties during the war, under names no one recognized. Such records might merely reflect smuggling and black market dealings so common under the stress of blockade. But a lingering theory is that the twins, stripped of their local sources, made deals further afield, selling stolen goods under assumed identities. Without photographic records and with communication shattered in wartime, an identical pair of women could reinvent themselves village after village. Together they were ghost, traitor, villain, and hostess all at once. By 1863, as the war bent toward exhaustion, the locals' fear deepened into myth. Families told children never to wander into the northern woods lest the twin ladies take you. Hunters swore their traps were emptied by unseen hands. A few Union soldiers on campaign left diary notes about strange receptions in households along the road, indistinguishable sisters who spoke in calm, clipped tones, offering drink which none dared refuse. One soldier swore his regiment lost 3 men on picket after an evening meal with those women and muttered about witches in Virginia who wear gentility like a mask. Whether the stories swelled because of superstition or because of the sisters, actual deeds may never be known. But by the war's final year, they were a legend as much as they were women. And when Lee surrendered at Appomattox and armies limped home, the legend did not fade. Instead, it became the story told by soldiers haunted by their traumas. "We fought men in blue," one veteran told his son, "but the only figures who truly chilled me wore dresses and smiled alike." As Reconstruction dawned, the estate itself fell quiet. Records in the county courthouse shrank to nothing after 1864. Taxes went unpaid. Neighbors said the gate lay unlatched and weeds crept across the drive. Servants scattered after the war, unwilling to remain in houses where laughter had once sounded too unearthly, too constant, too cruel. The sisters, somewhere in that confusion of surrender and rebuilding, vanished. Some historians believe they fled west, blending into new frontiers where no one remembered their names. 2 women answering identical descriptions appeared on lands in Missouri briefly in 1866, selling goods of curious origin. In Illinois, a grave from the late 1860s marks the twin wives with no more detail than that. Others say they never left at all, that their bones remained beneath Virginia soil, anonymous but restless. The legacy they left behind, however, only grew. Parents used their tale to sternly remind daughters of moral boundaries. Never tie yourself to sin through secrecy, never allow loyalty to corrupt your soul. Ministers thundered from pulpits about their sin as proof of the devil's temptations. Over decades, their story became less fact and more cautionary tale. And yet scraps of documentation, testimony at the edges of official records, and memories passed along in silence suggest something darker than parable, something real enough to stain Virginia's history. Every generation added embellishments. Some insisted the sisters took their wealth and thrived in the Midwest. Others whispered that bounty hunters one day dragged them eastward in chains, though no such arrest was ever recorded. A few claimed illnesses consumed them, that pox left them unrecognizable and buried unnamed. What threads together all versions are the same haunting impression: that the twins were never punished openly, that justice in the ordinary sense avoided them, and that their crimes became stories for communities to carry rather than verdicts a court would ever pronounce. By 1870, travelers along the road near the Ellery estate often remarked upon silence. Trees stood tall but no bird sang. The wind seemed stiller there, and animals stepped cautiously if they stepped there at all. The ruins of the barn still blackened the field, and some said the soil never grew green over it again. Superstition hardened each time someone paused at the abandoned property gates. Old men told their grandchildren of cursed twins who laughed while they poisoned whole households, while the twins themselves, wherever they had gone, remained silent shadows. Thus, their story straddled both history and myth. In that contrast lay the power of their legacy. For if the mystery had been solved, the book closed, then the tale would lose its teeth. But in lingering uncertainty, in rumors feeding one another, that is where terror lives. The twins thrive in that uncertainty even today, long after the soil of Virginia reclaimed their footsteps, their voices, their laughter too carefully entwined to be told apart. When the guns of the Civil War finally grew silent, Virginia faced a shattered landscape. Towns smoldered, railways lay in twisted ruin, and homes once proud stood hollow with grief. The Ellery estate, though scarred, still perched on its rise overlooking the road, visible to anyone traveling that part of the valley. Yet its silence was more unsettling than any ruin. Families who had lost sons to cannon fire avoided speaking too closely about losses they could not prove. But among themselves, as roofs were patched and fields replanted, they whispered still about the sisters. Shrouded by a war that consumed every census and court, the twins had stepped into folds of history where paper burned, records vanished, and men who might have accused them lay buried in trenches from Gettysburg to Petersburg. Reconstruction was supposed to bring order back. New officials arrived to enforce federal mandates, rebuild systems, and impose rules over a broken land. To them, the lingering stories of two women who lived strangely were little more than distractions, their eyes fixed on railroads, industry, and law enforcement that could not manage the outlaw bands roaming the hills. But for locals, memory did not vanish so quickly. They still crossed themselves when passing the abandoned Ellery Gate. They still carried warnings down generations, warnings not to wander into the fields where laughter had once carried without explanation. Whether the twins truly departed or merely sank deeper into the shadows depended entirely on whom you asked. Some swore that during those early Reconstruction years, identical women appeared in distant corners of the South. A merchant from Georgia swore that he sold dry goods to two women so alike they seemed as mirrors around 1866. In Tennessee, a barkeep scribbled in his ledgers that the sisters from Virginia with silver coin paid for lodging that same winter. These traces could be mere chance, figments mistaken in an era when photographs were rare and stories grander than reality. But each account fueled the legend. In their own county, the belief persisted that they had never truly gone. Farmers late at night claimed to see faint light flickering in the Ellery house, though its shutters appeared nailed shut. Travelers told of footsteps trailing them across moonlit roads, then vanishing into silence. Some even claimed to hear whispers, two voices alike enough that they blended into one, urging, coaxing, mocking, though none who made that claim had courage to linger long enough to be certain. The twins lingered not just in story but in atmosphere, bound to the place where their scandal had grown too poisonous to ignore. Yet others offered practical explanations. In hushed tones, men admitted the twins might have simply fled west. After all, in the years after the Civil War, whole families remade themselves under new names. Women who fell into public disgrace simply boarded trains or wagons, appearing next as school teachers or landowners far beyond the memory of old towns. Perhaps the sisters married again, leaving Virginia to claim husbands who never knew of their past. Such a theory calmed some, for to believe they still haunted the land was simply too much to bear. But doubts remained. More fragments from the years pull their story into focus, fragments jagged and incomplete. A widow in Kentucky recorded in her diary in 1867 that two women lodging nearby unnerved her greatly. I could not tell if my eyes betrayed me, but they were as identical as shadows and their manners too close. I prayed under my breath until they left. Around the same period, a small town Illinois newspaper mentioned an altercation in which two ladies of peculiar similarity were suspected of theft from a general store. Whether they were the same figures or mere coincidence is impossible to say. Yet once the seed of legend is planted, any sight of twins bore their stain. Still, certain details remained harder to dismiss. In 1869, a former Confederate soldier wrote in his memoirs about strange encounters along his march home. In 1865, he described being welcomed into a Virginia farmhouse by two identical women who insisted he rest while they prepared a simple meal. His companion, he said, ate heartily. By morning, only the soldier awoke. His companion was gone, though his rifle remained by the door. The soldier lingered in terror, afraid to accuse, but wrote years later, I suppose now he sleeps somewhere with dozens of others who trusted smiles too sweet. Critics dismissed the account as memory twisted by trauma, but those who already knew the legend whispered otherwise. There lies the extraordinary contrast of their legacy. Whether fact or fantasy, the fear persisted long after their presence could be confirmed. That is the essence of shadows. They spread wider once the light is uncertain. For every tale of their flight west came another of lanterns in abandoned windows. For every rumor of new lives came another of vanished travelers near those Virginia roads. The mystery thickened, refusing to yield one clear conclusion. As the 1870s approached, the county reshaped itself in Reconstruction's uneasy calm. Freedmen established small farms, new overseers attempted to wield authority, and industries emerged: tobacco houses, mills, workshops. But no one repaired the Ellery home. Its walls stood gray against weather, its windows eyeless. Children dared one another to run across its porch, but fled screaming before they could touch the door. School teachers passing through used the sisters' tale as a warning parable: how secrecy devours, how obsession corrupts, how crime consumes both family and fortune. Whatever truth lingered in courthouse ledgers had faded, leaving only story. And story always grows darker in the telling. By the late 1870s, the twins occupied the same place in the cultural mind as witches once had. Preachers borrowed their tale for sermons, sternly declaring that sin concealed in private will burst into ruin. Men used it as caution when teaching their sons about deceit. Mothers whispered it at night when warning daughters against strange loyalties. In this way, the sisters became less of themselves and more of a shadow archetype, held close not because they had been proven guilty in records, but because generations needed a face for fear. It was easier to call up the twins' ghosts than to admit the crueler possibility that communities collapse under silence, that people look away when truth is too shameful, and still there were stories. Late in the decade, a group of railroad workers claimed two women identical in every feature appeared repeatedly at camps near the Blue Ridge. Work crews grew so spooked that some deserted, unwilling to risk what they believed inevitable disaster. In Missouri, records of an innkeeper mentioned two Virginians of frightening likeness, who stayed several nights, then left behind unpaid bills and a bed shelf where stains were found. Even as rumor, such claims strengthened the notion that the sisters drifted like shadows, appearing where misery followed. The strongest reality may be this: once a legend takes hold, every set of identical twins encountered in the South for decades after seemed to wear their faces. One crime blamed on an unrelated pair becomes tied to them. One whispered theft attributed to them. One disappearance bound back into their myth. They became scapegoats for every shadow. This is what makes their story endure: uncertainty sharpened into inevitability by fear. If anything untoward occurred, and resemblance could be traced, the sisters re-emerged, if only in story. By 1880, their original county no longer debated fact. The twins' story had already become folklore. Old men at taverns spoke with certainty of their guilt, though proofs were forever absent, and children stared wide-eyed at each retelling. Fear of the unknown finds root most powerfully in repetition, and repetition built them into terrors greater than flesh could bear. Yet one chilling suggestion clings to the edges of history: those who swore they actually returned. A schoolteacher in Lynchburg recorded in 1882 that two identical older women stood silent at the edge of her schoolyard during recess, watching children play for nearly an hour before walking into the fields and vanishing. She admitted she might have misjudged distance, yet described faces uncannily alike, gazes unblinking. That account, if true, stretched their lives further than most had assumed possible. Were those merely look-alike sisters? Or had the figures who once filled Virginia with dread lingered still, surviving in anonymity only to reveal themselves like phantoms when the timing felt cruelest? Truth will never be stitched together with certainty. Reconstruction pushed the nation forward, but within those gaps and absences, myths thrive. The Ellery twins remained neither fully condemned nor absolved. Timeless shades who shared not only husbands, homes, and crimes, but also a fate so obscure that their story could grow endlessly in imagination. It is precisely this uncertainty that keeps their legend breathing a century and a half later. By the late 19th century, Virginia had changed dramatically. Railroads stitched the state to the rest of the country, small towns grew into cities, and industries of tobacco and steel reshaped valleys once ruled by plantations. Yet within the rhythms of modern progress lived the old stories, and among them, none carried as much persistent dread as the tale of the Ellery twins. For younger generations, It had become more than history. It was folklore, a trembling whisper carried by grandparents and claimed as gospel, though no evidence could ever be pinned cleanly to the page. In taverns and campfire circles, the twins were conjured as warning. If a man strayed too far in greed, elders muttered, he might find himself poisoned by beauty. If a woman fell too tightly into a partner's sin, she might lose distinction until she became one with another's crime. Bound together in duplicity, the twins emerged as symbols, not merely of two women who may or may not have conspired in mid-century Virginia, but of everything hidden and dangerous in the human heart. Yet the legend did not remain mere parable. Letters and accounts across the 1880s testify to sightings that refused to be dismissed as coincidence. In 1881, a New Orleans dock worker claimed two women of chilling likeness traded stolen goods along the riverfront. In 1884, a Baptist minister traveling in Arkansas wrote in his journal that he had been summoned to counsel two sisters, near identical, whose strange affections disturbed every member of their community. In 1887, a Missouri sheriff described investigating a farmstead robbery attributed to the Twin Ladies of Virginia legend. The sheriff himself doubted they were the same women. By then, they would have been well into their 50s. And yet stories spread faster than his caution, until whole communities swore the twins walked among them again. Such stories reveal more than possible fact. They show how a reputation, once fixed, exceeds the lifetime of its originators. The Ellery sisters, if indeed they lived so long, could never have divorced themselves from the shadow their past cast. Every theft, every vanishing merchant, every unnatural closeness among identical siblings recalled their names. It created a legend in which the sisters existed both everywhere and nowhere, haunting every place where trust soured and suspicion thrived. Virginia itself leaned further into the legend. Newspapers occasionally published sensational retellings of the story in their crime sections, offering lurid details of hushed poisonings and beds unchased, whether or not such legends had been authenticated. Rural pamphlets used their tale in reprints about frontier justice. For superstitious folk in quiet counties, the sisters became akin to ghost stories, figures who never aged, moving silently through moonlit roads, punishing those too blind to see danger concealed in beauty. Even skeptics could not quite laugh it away. It seemed that every decade offered some new report, some trace that breathed life back into the possibility that these two identical women lingered still. One of the most chilling tales emerged from a group of railroad workers in West Virginia in 1889. Accounts claimed they often saw two women in black, their faces mirrors of one another, perched near the tree line at dusk. At first, the men dismissed it as local girls or long shadows playing tricks. Yet after supplies vanished repeatedly, their nerves collapsed into belief. Several refused to work along that stretch until foremen calmed them down. Whether rogues, witches, or simple rumor, the appearance of the twins that year remained fixed in memory, enough to crack discipline among hardened laborers who risked dynamite and avalanche, yet cowered under the gaze of two silent women. A curious parallel unfolded at the same time in the realm of folklore studies. Writers eager to collect regional ghost tales noted the persistence of identical female figures across communities. In one printed collection of 1891, the Ellery twins were recast into extravagance, women who lured Confederate and Union soldiers alike into their home, only to rob them blind, who buried bodies under their orchard and ground bones into powder for their gardens. Expert historians dismissed it as melodramatic invention, but folklore collectors scarcely cared for proof. What mattered was the persistence of the legend, that it had roots deep enough to terrify generation after generation. But there was still the darker possibility that at least some of these stories were true. That the twins, now older and perhaps graying, found ways to reinvent themselves again and again. Identical faces grown lined but still unshakably alike could step into new towns under different surnames, weaving fresh nets of trust until suspicion caught them once more. Imagine them sitting quietly in a boarding house somewhere in Tennessee, never quite unrecognizable, never quite accused, just close enough to rumors that whispers flourished even if law never laid hold of them. Communities shaped by moral panic often feed off contrast, and in that contrast, the twins thrived. While progress marched forward, trains whistling, telegraphs crackling, cities swelling, they seemed relics of another age, reminders that civilization's march could not erase betrayal, crime, or secrets buried beneath polite veneers. In some ways, they became more frightening as the world modernized. If men could harness steel and fire but not banish the legends of two silent women who shared too much, then perhaps evil was not conquered by progress after all. One telling account from 1893 illustrates this tension. A young lawyer traveling through North Carolina confided in a letter that he boarded with two sisters whose likeness was uncanny, whose private whispers carried on house walls through the night. He awoke one morning to find money missing from his trunk. Though he could prove nothing, he wrote, "I carried on my way, convinced that I had met the Virginia twins of childhood stories, though whether it be true or false, my bones assure me of their identity." The lawyer lived a long, distinguished life, but in interviews near the end, he clung to that story, insisting that despite decades of rationality, the memory of those women remained unshakable. Such persistence shows how story transcends evidence. People needed the twins more than the twins themselves may have needed existence. As symbols, they explained the unexplainable: theft, loss, disappearance. As archetypes, they revealed society's fear of women unconfined, of families twisted, of loyalty rotting into blood-stained deceit. Communities used their memory as a mirror, frightening children, haunting guilty consciences, warning against broken boundaries. By the 1890s, children across Virginia played games at dusk, daring one another to look into windows of abandoned houses and chant the sisters' names. Parents scolded them, but sometimes used the story to discipline. Stay in your bed, or the twins will come. Such ritualized fear cemented their immortality. Long after their real lives, long after any bones returned to dust, the twins lived on in every whispered caution. A stranger question lingers here. Did the twins know the legend they had become? If alive, did they smile quietly as their rumors grew, pulling cloaks tighter as new names were spoken with fear? Or did they die early, their story exaggerated by decades until they became phantoms invented out of absence? History leaves us no sure answer, but in the uncertainty lay their greatest victory. Guilt may bind a criminal to law, but ambiguity binds them forever to memory. By the century's end, the Ellery twins had been transfigured completely. No longer two women of flesh, but icons of secrecy and sin. They no longer needed names, dates, or places, for theirs was a legend broad enough to fit every theft, every poisoned cup, every whisper that corruption lived beside us in plain sight. To say the twins in a Virginia tavern was to conjure the image entirely. Laughter too close, mirror images blurred into crime. And to this day, that single phrase haunts archives like a candle flickering in dust. Its evidence unsettled, but its weight undeniable. As the 19th century decayed into the 20th, the story of the Ellery twins refused to fade into the backdrop of history. Virginia, and indeed much of the post-war South, found its economy transformed, its towns modernized, and its communities increasingly connected by rails, wires, and the rush of industry. But even as new inventions promised progress, the countryside still whispered of the past. Among those whispers, none sent shivers through families more deeply than the legacy of the twins who, according to scattered memory, had shared far more than just their childhood. By 1900, the actual estate where they once lived lay in ruins. Land records show it had been auctioned quietly in the 1870s when no heir stepped forward. Weeds swallowed the porch, vines twisted up its walls, and weather stripped its roof bare. Children of Lynchburg in that era avoided the property by instinct. Those dared to enter often came running out pale, claiming to see two shapes at the stair, hand in hand, watching. Teachers at the nearby school had to forbid students from retelling ghost stories aloud in class. So distracting had the legends become. Folklorists from northern states, eager to collect stories of the Old South, diligently recorded the Ellery twins' tales. Their notebooks capture the way oral tradition reshaped memory into haunting allegory. In some tellings, the twins became witches who dug shallow graves behind their orchard. In others, they were treated as demons, created as punishment against a community that had harbored too much pride. More sympathetic versions emerged too, painting them as women driven to cruelty by a society that left them no escape. But regardless of the interpretation, their bond was always the same: inseparable, mirror images twisted into something the community could neither control nor forgive. This was not simply fear of crime. It was deeper fear of broken boundaries, Families insisted to daughters that they must never allow another soul such control, that individuality mattered, for to lose it meant losing one's morality. Husbands were warned too. Never silence suspicion for pride, or risk ending like Thomas Ellery, destroyed by his refusal to confront the truth. The twins became moral examples as much as horror figures. Their legacy was used to draw lines between safety and danger, decency and ruin. The newspapers of the 1910s occasionally revived their legend, particularly around Halloween, when reporters relished the chance to weave history with the supernatural. One Richmond paper described the Ellery story as the Southern sisters whose crimes remain cloaked, whose laughter lingers still on moonlit roads. These pieces blurred journalism with fright, drawing readers in and further cementing the twins as cultural myth. It mattered less whether they had truly poisoned neighbors and more that they embodied the shadow side of genteel society. The mere act of reprinting their legend kept them alive, even if as a ghostly caricature. Communities imprisoned by superstition still spoke of sightings. In 1907, a traveler documented in his journal that two gray-haired ladies of identical appearance offered him bread at a roadside, though he quickly rode away, fearing their reputation. Stories like this spread through taverns like wildfire. Ordinary encounters made sinister through legend's lens. The real tragedy was clear. Even if other identical sisters roamed the South, they bore a burden of suspicion, forever mistaken for the Ellery twins, no matter their innocence. The legend scarred not just the memory of two women, but the lives of any who resembled them in eerie ways. Songs emerged too. Appalachian ballads carried verses about the twin brides of Virginia, describing voices echoing down rivers, luring men away to disappear forever. These songs, half lament and half warning, made their tale accessible to farmers and laborers who could neither read nor write, but who carried melody in their bones. Each chorus exaggerated details, each verse darkened events further. By the time these ballads reached recording folklorists in the 1920s, the twins were no longer human in lyrics. They had become preternatural forces, specters hand in hand, poisoning rivers and stealing lives indiscriminately. Why did such stories take root so powerfully? The answer lies less in fact than in psychology. Communities scarred by war, poverty, and hardship projected their fears into myths that gave shape to chaos. The twins represented the unease of trusting faces too familiar, of love that turned corrupted, of society's failure to confront violence hidden within its own houses. They represented betrayal from inside rather than attack from outside. And in a region reshaping itself rapidly through industrialization, that message carried weight. Technology and industries changed, but the fear of betrayal, of secrets too well hidden, never shifted. One particularly eerie account from 1913 came from a rural preacher's memoir. He claimed to have been summoned late one evening to calm two sisters rumored to practice dark arts in his county. He arrived, found them standing silently by a fire, their faces nearly indistinguishable though they were old. They said nothing but fixed him with mirrored eyes until he was forced to retreat. He wrote later, "I reckon they may not have been of earthly birth at all." This account reads almost certainly embellished, but it exemplifies how folklore blurred reality. Ordinary encounters transfigured into encounters with specters because memory demanded it. Such tales achieved permanence by embedding themselves in seasonal rituals. By the 1920s, Southern children were daring one another to chant the Ellery twins 3 times after dark in front of mirrors as a ghostly game. They were invoked in parlor seances, their legend tied to the rising fascination with spiritualism. Magazines eager for ghost content featured short fictional pieces loosely based on them, inventing elaborate tales of poisoned soldiers and cursed orchards. Their names had long ceased to belong to the actual women. They now belonged to myth. And yet there are notes of possibility that the sisters, if alive and aged, carried on quietly among these rumors. Census records from Kentucky, Maryland, and Ohio reveal households with sisters of the appropriate age living together unmarried. Some historians theorize that one or more of these may have been the original twins, reinvented under new names. But no confirmation surfaces. What matters is that the mystery itself became oxygen for the legend. Whenever doubt hung in the air, the story breathed again. For survivors of Civil War Virginia who lived into the new century, they carried not just stories but memories. A handful of letters from aged veterans mention how nothing in battle frightened them, quite like the night they crossed paths with the sisters. One claimed that every time he thought of Antietam, he remembered their faces more vividly than the dead piled on the ground. To carry such a memory for 50 years says less about evidence and more about impact. Trauma latches onto certain images, in this case 2 women who symbolized danger from within. The Eerie twins thus became a ghost of both history and psychology. Whether alive, missing, or nothing more than rumor, they lingered precisely because their story touched something deeply human. The unsettling realization that our fears often wear familiar faces. By the early 20th century, they no longer needed to be proven, for their myth explained what evidence could not, knitting together generations with one chilling refrain, "Beware the twins." By the turn of the 20th century, the Eerie twins had shifted from whispered scandal to entrenched folklore. They were no longer simply 2 curious sisters accused of strange crimes in an antebellum community. They were fixtures of ghost lore, invoked with dread in sermons, folklore collections, and the small rituals of children who dared one another at dusk. As the decades advanced, their story only widened, seeping from Virginia outward, attaching itself like ivy to every corner of American imagination. Folklore scholars of the 1910s and 1920s found themselves inundated with versions of the tale. Collected volumes from Appalachia, Louisiana, and even distant Oregon referenced the twin sisters of Virginia as harbingers of death, omens of poison, or spectral figures haunt-treading lonely roads. Some accounts stripped their context entirely, presenting them as ghostly apparitions who appeared at midnight before calamity. In one tale, a farmer saw 2 identical women by a river, and the next day his fields went up in flames. In another, children saw them looking through a schoolhouse window before a sickness swept the town. These expansions bore little relation to the history buried in Lynchburg's county records. But folklore is not about accuracy. It's about survival. The story survived because it captured archetypes deeper than history. America at the dawn of the 20th century was anxious with progress, electrification, and modernization that outstripped comprehension. Traditional fears needed new forms, and the Eerie twins provided just that, familiar faces carrying uncanny threat. They became symbols that technology could not erase, markers that evil was not always foreign or distant, but instead intimate, close, and indistinguishable from family itself. Newspapers leaned into their marketable dread. Around Halloween, local editors would reprint embellished true crime columns retelling the twins' supposed murders, with ominous illustrations of mirror-like women clasping hands under a blood moon. Rural magazines even serialized fictionalized versions that exaggerated every element. Arsenic in teacups, daggered betrayals of husbands, secret burials in orchards. Each generation darkened the tale further. The Eerie twins no longer needed to be proven guilty. They existed now because retelling kept them alive. In small towns and rural schoolhouses, the story lived strongest in children's games. By the 1920s and 1930s, children dared one another to recite the names of the twins in front of mirrors, or call them under moonlight. They became Southern America's answer to modern Bloody Mary rituals long before that term existed. The details shifted depending on county. Some children swore you had to clasp hands with your own sibling while chanting. Others insisted you needed to light 2 candles and whisper, "They shared it all," 3 times. Whether anything appeared mattered less than the shudder of dread that swept over their games. These rituals secured the twins' immortality in culture, embedding them beyond written history and into lived, repeated childhood fear. More remarkable still is how often their names appeared as caution in formal sermons. Preachers across the South in the early 20th century invoked them as symbols of corrupted devotion. Congregations squirmed as pastors described how the twin sisters of Virginia forgot the Lord and made idols of each other, until their bond was stronger than truth itself. Whether or not parishioners fully believed the historical specifics, they knew the moral, family, when twisted, can become sin as destructive as any blade. Such sermons passed their legend onto new generations not as ghost story, but as moral lesson. Meanwhile, American pulp fiction magazines of the 1920s and 1930s devoured such legends. Writers of horror and mystery wove in allusions to identical sisters haunting plantations, sometimes outright naming Virginia as their origin. Tales like The Poisoned Orchard or the bride's double, drew heavily from Ellery lore, embellishing with supernatural flourish. Always two women, mirror images, always one cup too bitter, one night too long. These magazines rarely cited sources, but audiences recognized the pattern, for folklore had already conditioned them. The twins became less about one county scandal and more about the universal dread of doubles who could not be told apart, doubles who killed. But the persistence of local reports fuels curiosity still. Even in the 20th century, sightings continued to surface. In 1924, a traveling salesman in Kentucky reported to police that he had been offered supper by women too alike to tell apart. Suspicious, he claimed he refused, but later found his wagon ransacked. In 1931, an elderly farmer from southern Virginia swore before his death that he once saw two women walking hand in hand at sunset along the ruins of the Ellery house, though by then the ruins should have been vacant. For over half a century, as late as 1947, a tourist in West Virginia insisted he spotted gray-haired twins who looked at me with unnatural calm before walking together into the woods. Were these real encounters? Likely not. But the very act of recording them, in police notes, diaries, or oral testimony, breathed continual life into the legend. The women, whether dead or alive, whether ever guilty or not, became phantoms woven into American imagination. Unlike typical criminals, whose lives end with capture or trial, the Ellery twins escaped resolution. That escape was their greatest power. Without an ending, their story became a loop. One retold endlessly, reshaped to fit any dread demanded by the teller. The 1950s, with its rising fascination in psychology and criminology, even invited academics to debate them. In journals debating criminal doubles and psychological enmeshment among siblings, references to anonymous identical sisters in antebellum Virginia cropped up as amateur case studies. Though unsourced and speculative, they fascinated researchers. Were such women possible examples of folie à deux, madness shared by two, a psychological illness still debated at the time? Or were they purely folkloric shadows reshaped until they no longer belonged to reality? Scholars could not decide, but once again, they kept the twins alive in print. By the middle of the century, the Ellery twins were almost unrecognizable as women. They were legends of the double, proof that even love between siblings could rot into destruction if unchecked. They were invoked during the World Wars when wives and families prayed for their sons abroad, reminding them that dangers sometimes wore familiar faces. They were invoked in the Cold War era too, woven into Southern ghost tours which told visitors of mirror-faced sisters whose laughter echoed in burned halls. They remained endlessly adaptable. In the end, their immortality came not from truth, but from ambiguity. If they had been arrested, tried, and proven guilty, they would have been lost among thousands of names and dusty court records. If they had been disproven entirely, forgotten as rumor, their story would have withered. But their legend straddled that fragile line between evidence and myth, creating a void where imagination could thrive. And in that void lived every horror unspoken, the fear that you might sit across from someone you knew intimately, trust them fully, and never realize until too late that their loyalty was only to someone else entirely. By the close of the 20th century, the Ellery twins had fully crossed into American folklore's haunted corridors. They were summoned in college ghost story anthologies, included in compendiums of Southern haunts, described alongside bell witches and Appalachian phantoms. They became less about Virginia, less about any one crime, and instead about the dread of the double self. To fear them was to fear loss of identity, loss of trust, and the prison of secrecy turned violent. They had outlasted every scrap of evidence, every witness, every memory. They lived longer as myth than they ever could have in flesh. By the close of the 20th century, the Ellery twins had passed completely into the long shadow of folklore, yet their names still conjured unease. What began as whispers of scandal in antebellum Virginia had multiplied into legends thick with poison, betrayal, mirror-like cruelty, and endless sightings. They no longer belonged to their own lifetimes, if they ever had at all, but to every generation that repeated them with suspicion and dread. And perhaps that is the truest definition of immortality, to survive not by flesh and breath, but by story. It is tempting to believe the legend was exaggerated to the point of fantasy, that any bonds of twinship, particularly those so close as to blur boundaries, would naturally provoke suspicion in a culture wary of difference. Perhaps the tales of poison, arsenic-laced wine, or stolen travelers were merely projections of fear imposed upon women who lived strangely. And yet, countering that temptation stand the fragments. A ledger pulled from a burned barn, a merchant who vanished mid-journey, scraps of cloth seen again as drapery in the twins' parlor. These details cling like burrs in the cloth of history, small, almost ignorable, yet enough to suggest the horror was not entirely invented. That tension between evidence too faint to convict and stories too powerful to deny explains why the twins' memory spread like fire. Communities could not let them rest because they represented survival of secrecy within familiar walls. They were not outsiders with foreign faces. They were kin, daughters of Virginia soil, wives who stood proudly in the pews. Their betrayal was sharper than any bandit's ambush because it came from hands trusted, faces loved. Communities recorded their memory not because they were witches, but because they proved that evil often wears the guise of ordinary affection. When one examines the progression of their tale into the 20th century, it is astonishing how smoothly it transformed. Historians reprinted them as case study, preachers as moral parable, folklorists as ghost tale. Children recited them in games as easily as their alphabet. Horror writers looted their memory for plots. Musicians wove them into lyric. The Ellery twins appeared everywhere precisely because they never had a final chapter. That absence of resolution, no grave, no trial, no recorded execution, meant their story could be stretched endlessly across every generation's anxieties. Even today, their name lingers. In small corners of Virginia ghost tours, guides recount their lives as naturally as battlefield apparitions. Paranormal investigators swear they hear laughter when they approach the ruins of their old estate. Travelers say they feel watched when walking the roads near Lynchburg after dark. Photographs occasionally circulate online. Blurry shapes claim to be two women arms in arm in abandoned farmhouses. Rational explanation dismisses them, yet their power persists. Because after all, in folklore, proof is not required. Belief sustains itself. The question that haunts most is not whether they were guilty, but whether the truth was buried deliberately. Did local law refuse to pursue them because powerful men were involved? Did their wealth insulate them? Did terror silence the servants who knew too much? These unanswered possibilities create a vacuum, and into that vacuum flows story. People will tell themselves anything to fill silence, particularly when that silence is uncomfortable. And so, year after year, decade after decade, their lives became less about what occurred and more about what might have occurred, until the line faded entirely. But perhaps the most unsettling fact of all is that their story reveals more about us than about them. Whenever we retell their lives, we reveal what frightens us most. In the 1800s, they terrified because they blurred gender and social roles, women too independent and too inseparable. In the post-war years, they terrified as witches haunting broken soil. By the Cold War, they were invoked as symbols of doubles, of hidden dangers infecting communities from within. Each retelling bent them toward the fears of the era. They remain relevant precisely because their legend is elastic, shaping itself to whatever dread the times demand. Imagine them now. In our century of images and digital records, they would be no mystery. Yet even modernity has its doubles, its secrets, its bonds grown too obsessive. Their story still warns, beware what hides behind trust, beware what wears your own face, beware what binds two people so completely that nothing, not morality, not love, not law, can divide them. The Ellery twins endure because they are not simply two women in Virginia. They are every nightmare about deception too close to recognize. And so if one travels the back roads of Virginia at night, it is easy to understand why the story lingers. The air grows heavy across the hills, the fields fall silent, and the ruins of old houses seem to watch as one passes. Some claim the wind whistles like laughter if you listen long enough. Few linger deliberately. Fewer still would enter the broken shell of the old Ellery property, where weeds curl around stone and owls perch in rafters left blackened over a century ago. Those who dare sometimes claim they see them still, two women clasping hands, waiting. This is not history as courtroom record. This is history as shadow, unresolved, retold until it transcends fact. And whether inside superstition or truth, the Ellery twins remind us of the cost of silence, of loyalty corrupted, of love bred into ruin. They remind us that beneath good manners and polished parlor windows may lurk the darkest crimes, and that sometimes the monsters we fear most are the ones who sleep under the same roof, sit at the same table, and smile with faces too familiar to doubt. Now it is your turn to linger in that darkness and decide. Do you believe these sisters were guilty of their neighbors' disappearances? Do you believe history exaggerated them into myth? Or do you, like many who passed their property under moonlight, believe that some truths were deliberately buried, left to breathe only as frightful rumor? Whatever you decide, the Ellery twins endure, whispering their warnings from the distance of centuries. If this story has left you unsettled, if the echoes of their laughter linger in your imagination, then keep that feeling alive. These are the kinds of forgotten mysteries and dark truths we uncover here with every tale. To stay with us for the next shadow, the next figure buried beneath polite history, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. Click that notification bell so you enter with us every week into another darkness. Like this video if their story left you chilled, and in the comments tell us what you think of the Ellery twins. Are they villains, victims, or legends we've made larger than life? Your thoughts keep this conversation alive, and this community thrives on shared curiosity. Because history is not only about what we know, it is about what we fear. And in that silence, in that space between fact and dream, illusions and recorded names, the Ellery twins still wait. Two faces, two hands linked, and a story that refuses to end.